I think are words on the lab. And what's that? I don't know, I don't really agree with, they say covered by arachnoid, I would say covered by pia mater. There's that little bit of membrane that you see there. This is the longitudinal fissure. And here we can see this, the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe are the only ones we can really pick out that are separated by the sylvian fissure. Okay, and we see some brain stem and some cerebellum. About all we're getting there. And pia mater, that membrane that adheres tightly to. So if I ask you pia mater, I think I'm gonna have to use a picture like this. Okay, and of course gyri and sulci. Gyri are the ridges, and each sulcus is a little valley or whatever you want to call that. So the surface of the cerebrum is highly wrinkled, and that surface area of gray matter is called the cortex. Okay, sylvian fissure, right there. And this is a good view of the central sulcus. Okay, central sulcus right there. And none of our models actually show the lobes in different colors. They show other interesting things though. I might have to, if I asked that, I'd probably use a picture. So the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Here's temporal lobe, occipital lobe. And of course, those are all parts of the cerebrum. And here we were looking at a lateral view of the brain, and we removed the front half, or the left half, so that we could see down the inside of the longitudinal fissure. And what we see is the only structure that connects the two halves of the brain, which is the corpus callosum. So, and I forget what other things. The corpus callosum, the front part of it is called the genu of the corpus callosum, and the rear part is called the splenium of the corpus callosum. And corpus callosum shows up beautifully in a mid-sagittal MRI, along with all kinds of other things. And here you see them all, and a lot of them are lab words. The cerebral aqueduct right there, passing down to the fourth ventricle, and the cerebellum. And if you use your imagination, you can see the four bumps on the back of the midbrain, the corpora quadrigemina. And we've sliced, this isn't exactly on the midline, but we've sliced through a little bit of the thalamus. If it's precisely on the midline, you shouldn't be able to see the thalamus. Okay, because it's bilateral, two bilateral structures. All you'd be able to see is the interthalamic adhesion. Here's someone that was born without a corpus callosum. We've looked at that. What's G stand for? Genu and splenium and the body of the corpus callosum. Basal nuclei, there are a couple representations on our model that show those. And slicing through all those structures like the thalamus and the basal nuclei gives you no clue really as to what's going on. kind of useful maybe in certain contexts. Here we see the lateral ventricles, and down here are actually the frontal horns of the lateral ventricles. They come way down. One of the words that I added over there. Okay. And here's a better view showing the rather exotic shapes of some of these structures. The thalamus, or thalami if you like, because they're really two bilateral structures. The pineal gland, just inferior to those. The corpora quadrigemina, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, the caudate nucleus, lentiform nucleus, and I don't know if amygdala is a lab word or not. I don't think it is. However, mammillary bodies are lab words, and they actually show up on the models. The optic chiasma, where the two optic nerves cross. Okay, basal nuclei again, caudate nucleus, and lentiform nucleus with the thalamus and medial. And so this is an inferior view of the brain with a whole bunch of stuff cut away, and we can see inside of the lateral ventricle, and we can actually see the hippocampus and a bunch of other structures, some cerebellum on one side, and pineal gland right there, and there's the four bumps looking at them from the underneath. Okay, and here's a posterior view, posterolateral view. Here's the huge trigeminal nerve coming out of the pons. Remember, trochlear nerve, corpora quadrigemina, pineal gland, the two thalami, okay, that are connected by the interthalamic adhesion. And we've removed, normally we see a big, huge cerebellum coming out at us, but we've taken it away, and we're looking at the inner wall of the fourth ventricle. And here we're looking at an anterolateral view of the brainstem, showing pons. These are these big bundles of motor fibers coming out of the cerebrum called the cerebral peduncles. This is a continuation of those motor bundles coming down the front side of the medulla oblongata called the pyramidal tracts. And here we see these cerebellar peduncles that connect the pons to this cerebellum, cerebellar peduncles. And thalamus. Another one of those slicey views. Another one shows the two halves of the thalamus. This is an axial slice. And you can see that little interthalamic adhesions that connects the two halves. We're looking at a coronal slice. Did I say coronal before? It's coronal. And you can see the very little tip of the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. This down here is hypothalamus. And what over here we see slicing through the basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. And corpus callosum. Mammillary bodies, cerebral peduncles, thalami, the optic chiasma, the optic nerve, pons, medulla oblongata with the pyramidal tracts coming down the front that connect to all the skeletal muscles. So what are we slicing through here?
Mickey Mouse.
Midbrain, because it looks like Mickey Mouse. Cerebral peduncles, this is Mickey's eyebrows, is where we make dopamine, the substantia nigra, and the cerebral aqueduct. Backside of the brainstem, corpora quadrigemina. Looking, sagittal slice through the fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, cerebellum, pons, midbrain, oculomotor nerve. You see a whole bunch of cranial nerves coming out of the brainstem. Okay, slice through the medulla oblongata, and we see these big bundles of motor fibers on the anterior aspect called the pyramidal tracts. And there's fourth ventricle. So here we see those motor tracts coming out of the cerebrum. Brainstem, we have midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. You can see the four little bumps in the back. Cerebellum. And here's a top view of the cerebellum. You can see this structure in the middle is called the vermis of the cerebellum. It's a little higher than the rest of the cerebellum, and it's, as you slice on down through the brain, it's the first part that you see of the cerebellum. Vermis is the Latin word for worm. Here's the cerebellum showing really how large it is in an axial slice. The cerebellum is covered by meningeal structures just like the brain. And the meninges that cover the cerebellum are called a tentorium cerebelli. And that's a Latin word. Tentorium is Latin for tent. Okay, so big cerebellum, fourth ventricle with pons, and all this is the connection between the pons and the cerebellum. Ah, man, the ventricles, two different views of the ventricles. Here we see the temporal horn coming out to the front, and we see the foramina of Monroe that connect the lateral ventricles with the third ventricle, which is on the midline, the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle, and the central canal of the spinal cord. From side view, we see the frontal horns, the occipital horns, and the temporal horns of the lateral ventricle. And where those three come together is called the trigone of the lateral ventricle. And those are all lab words there. And since these things show up so commonly on images, I saw fit to add those. Should have been on here in the first place. So this is third ventricle. What's this we see right there? Remember, the ventricles are fluid-filled cavities. This is a little bit of tissue passing through the third ventricle. What is it?
Oh, the interthalamic.
Interthalamic adhesion. Connects the two halves of the thalamus. Okay. Oh, so add those words. Well, I didn't have to write that on the board. If I'd have looked at this a little bit more carefully. Septum pellucidum is a lab word, and there is one place where the lateral ventricles get so close that the only thing that separates them is a little membrane. That's how close they are. You really can hardly see it here, and that's called the septum pellucidum. And we see choroid plexuses. There's a tour hypophyseal adenoma, which is a tumor on the pituitary shown in a sagittal slice and a coronal slice. And the only way to get at the pituitary, remember, is to go up through the cribriform plate, basically, shatter the cribriform plate, and you lose your sense of smell. But this is a very dire condition. So, what's that structure right there? Thalamus. Okay, a little bit of midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. What's that? Corpus callosum. Yeah. And this is lateral ventricle. So this is not a perfect mid-sagittal slice. It's to one side. Because if it were perfectly mid-sagittal, you wouldn't see this. All you'd see is the interthalamic adhesion, and you wouldn't see the lateral ventricle either. But they also are bilateral. The meninges, and we see here the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And these little structures that poke up into this vein, which is the superior sagittal sinus, these are the arachnoid villi. And that's a lab word. Arachnoid villi are the counterparts of the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus produced cerebrospinal fluid. The arachnoid villi removed it. And we see dura mater and arachnoid. And the arachnoid, remember, is the one that contains all the vessels. Falx cerebri is comprised of a double layer of meninges, and it attaches to the crista galli down here. Okay, cranial nerve roots. The spinal cord, the last little bit of the cord that kind of is pointy, like right down there, actually shows up on one of our models, and it's called the conus medullaris. And then what are all these little filaments called? Cauda equina, which is Latin for horsetail. So right about L1 is about where the cord ends in the conus medullaris. And then we have cauda equina. And the filum terminale anchors is a connective tissue structure that anchors the cord to the coccyx. So there you can see cauda equina. Right there's the conus medullaris, isn't it? Spinal nerves, epidural space. So we have cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, and lumbar nerves, and sacral nerves. And the plexuses, we've talked about the plexus a little bit, haven't we?
Yeah.
We have the cervical plexus, which is not very dramatic, really. However, the brachial plexus is huge. Okay, and you can see someone has done a lot of work dissecting tissue away from the brachial plexus there. Okay, lumbar plexus in the lumbar region, L1 through L5, and it sends a couple major nerves down into the sacral plexus. Sacral plexus gives rise to the sciatic nerve and a bunch of other important nerves. The sciatic nerve is the largest nerve in the body. So here's L4 and L5. This is a lumbar plexus. Okay. But L4 and L5 take off inferiorly and become part of the sacral plexus, which is there. See L4 and L5? Okay. And this branch right here, L5, that is a major connection between the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus, is known as the lumbosacral trunk. That'll be a lab word next time, I think. largest nerve in the body, sciatic nerve. Okay. So, sacral plexus. So here's a little quiz. What's that structure? This is brachial plexus, isn't it? So what's that? Well, it's kind of hard to say, but conus medullaris. And what are those? Cauda equina. How about that? Phylum terminal. How about that? Falx cerebri. How about that little membrane there? One of my favorite things to ask, septum pellucidum. Corpora quadrigemina. I just love the way that rolls off the tongue. The pineal gland. What's that? Trigeminal nerve, isn't it? Okay, and so what are we looking at here? That's the vermis of the cerebellum. And there's, what's that?
Midbrain.
Midbrain, yeah. Okay, and arachnoid villi. I could be asking a whole lot of different things on here, couldn't I? Arachnoid, dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid villi. False. So, I could ask a whole bunch of things on here. Okay, this is for the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, frontal horn of the lateral ventricle, the trigone, right there. Fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, third ventricle, foramen of Monroe. There you can see septum pellucidum, choroid plexuses. What are those? Arachnoid villi. What's that? Oh, well, midbrain. Cerebral aqueduct. Okay, pons, fourth ventricle. And right in there is the membrane we call the tentorium cerebelli. I can't really see it, although they label it, but I don't see any membrane in there. Okay, so let's